Shalom. Many thanks to Lev Weidman and to the organizing committee for the possibility to take part in this great conference. So, Wittgensteinian demystification of the many worlds interpretation. Oh, sorry.
Introduce you in a minute. Just one. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go on. It's going to be just for a few seconds. So if you need it, please hurry up and have it. These are the details for the Wi-Fi. And I'm now glad to introduce our next speaker, Francois Igor Priz, from the Institute of Philosophy in Belarus Academy of Science.
Okay. Toda. So, Wittgenstein, many thanks to Lev Weidman and to the organizing committee for the possibility to take part in this great conference. So, a Wittgensteinian demystification of the many world interpretation, point of view of contextual realism. So, first of all, I am sympathetic to Everett's interpretation, to Lev Weidman's and David Wallace's approaches. I agree that there is no quantum measurement problem. I think that, in a sense, quantum theory describes reality just fine. I emphasize in a sense, because I think that it describes the reality locally in a context, not globally. And at the same time, I think that philosophy has something to say more about maybe about the existence or inexistence of the many worlds, in which sense they are real. So for Wallace, the other worlds are as real as are you and our mutual surroundings. Also for him, macroscopic superpositions describe multiplicity. In particular, in Schrödinger's Gedanken experiment, it is far more accurate to say that a state is a superposition of a live cat and a dead cat, not a cat in a superposed state of being alive and being dead. And Wallace adopts naturalism and Stretchford realism. I think Wallace and most of physicists adopt so-called metaphysical realism. And if we commit ourselves to metaphysical realism, Valia Valori said that many world interpretation is a weak realism. On the contrary, I think that it adopts a form of strong realism. If we commit ourselves to metaphysical realism and classical logic, we are forced to adopt many worlds interpretation. But I think the metaphysical realism is problematic. And I think that we should replace it by what I call a contextual realism. And grosso modo, the metaphysical realism is characterized by two traits. First, there is, in an important sense, independent from the subject objective reality. And second, the objective reality is the reality of objects situated in front of the subject and completely detached from the subject. And contextual realism keeps only one, the commitment of the independent of existence and mind independence. So scientific realism, standard form of scientific realism, is a kind of metaphysical realism. So what I call contextual realism or Wittgensteinian contextual realism it's my interpretation of later Wittgenstein's philosophy and the so-called contextual realism of the contemporary French philosopher Jocelyn Benoist. So it's my view, but I will refer to Jocelyn Benoist and to later Wittgenstein. And I think that there are two basic postulates. First, the concept of reality is the primary concept, and the grammar of the concept reality is just what it is. So we need to understand correctly the conception of reality. And second, there is a categorical distinction between the ideal and the real. Rules, norms, concepts are ideal. Theory is ideal. But they are anchored in reality. In this sense, they are real. They are real in a weak sense. And by the way, the sensible is real. It belongs to the category of real. So the first, the primary unconceptualized, unintentional experience And contextual realism is not a doctrine. It is not a specific kind of metaphysical realism. And I quote, contextuality is not a constraint. I quote Jocelyn Benoist, contextuality is the fundamental epistemological and ontological property of reality. Epistemology and ontology are sensitive to context. And this means that ontology is not predetermined. I think that contextual realism combines two conditions, non-predeterminacy, or if you want, indeterminism, and realism. So for me, the Everettian worlds, a live cat and a cat, dead cat, they are real, but they are not predetermined. They are identified in context. Ontology, in Quine's sense, is secondary. And there are no global ontology of the Everettian worlds. I think that for Wallace, there is global ontology of the Everettian worlds. So because I refer to Leitch and Wittgenstein, I will not define all notions, just a language game for me. It's one of the basic notions. There are a few basic notions. Family resemblance, form of life, grammar, hinge propositions. They don't have justification, hinge propositions. And there is the rule-following problem. This is the central problem. It allows us to combine all Wittgenstein's notion in a holistic system. Language game is an intentional action or a normative practice. This is a normative pragmatism. And if you want, language game is an application or use of a Wittgensteinian rule. Language game is governed by a Wittgensteinian rule, which is rooted in an experience, reality of form of life. So very briefly, I think that we obey, according to Wittgenstein, a rule blindly, but very briefly, I think that the problem that there is a gap between formal rule and its application. We cannot close it. In another sense, a gap between a Wittgensteinian rule and its application does not exist. It is closed within its application. Use language game from the very beginning. Wittgenstein quote Goethe, in the beginning was the dead. And this is helpful to dissolve the so-called measurement problem. By the way, to compare, to establish the relation with Benoist's contextual realism, I think that the structure of Wittgensteinian rule-following problem and Benoist's contextual realism is the same structure. This is the structure of the rule-following problem. This is the structure of the gap between the ideal and the real, because rules are ideal and their applications are real. I quote Benoist, the gap between the factual and the norm, which is intended to define it correctly or incorrectly, seems to me to constitute a fundamental structure of what I call realism. This is a realism of a rule, in a sense of a rule, which treats the real instances not as approximations of anything, but as applications, correct or incorrect, of the rule. And Wittgensteinian contextual realism overpasses the modern and postmodern philosophy, postmodern as a degenerate or limit case of the modern philosophy. So-called, also, this is the criticisms of the so-called new realisms of the 21st century. They have something in common. They criticize postmodernism, but not very consistently. They have a strong anti-realistic dimension. So, but there is something in common, and this is criticisms of epistemic realism of modern philosophy. Epistemic realism reduces reality to objectivity, and I think this is important because for quantum mechanics, I quote Jaynes, somewhere the distinction in quantum theory between reality and our knowledge of reality has become lost. And Einstein said the epistemology sought ought to come to an end. So there are other premises and prejudices of modern philosophy, not only epistemic realism, representationalism, subject-object dualism, subjectivism and internalism, primacy of the epistemology, the concept of the exterior world, and so on. By the way, postmodern philosophy thinks that we cannot separate being from its representation. It's false. So reality is the primary concept. Ontology is determined by the Wittgensteinian rule, sensitive to context. And this is the Wittgensteinian contextual realism. And I think that what is identified, observed, or measured in experience, in quantum experience, experiment, exists and had existed before it was identified, but it had no identity. It had not been predetermined. Therefore, it did not make sense to speak or to think of it before its identification. Peres said, unperformed experiments have no results. And anti-realist thinks that before the observation of something, there was no point insane. It agrees with contextual realism, but it seems that it concludes that it did not exist, that an observation creates the result of observation, and maybe even the observed object. On the contrary, the metaphysical realists say he accepts that what is observed existed before the observation and concludes that it was predetermined. I think that it misses the epistemological point. So, in particular, some Copenhagenist interpretations, they don't make distinction between predetermination and pre-existence. So my claim is that from a philosophical point of view, quantum mechanics is an anomaly within the paradigm of modern philosophy. That is why, as Mermin said, new interpretations appear every year, none ever disappear. We cannot understand correctly quantum mechanics from the point of view of modern or postmodern philosophy. Anti-realistic and realistic interpretations are situated within modern philosophy paradigm. Metaphysical, I emphasize metaphysical, many worlds interpretation, Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics, Chris Fuchs' cubism, they share some premises of modern philosophy. Actually, there are two extremes, physicalist, naturalistic, and subjectivist, phenomenological. And contextual realism is neither anti-realistic nor realistic in the metaphysical sense. One example, Anton Seilinger says, the distinction between reality and our knowledge of reality, between reality and the information, cannot be made. This is an anti-idealistic position. This is false. So, some other philosophers, for example, Michel Bitbol, Laura de la Tremblay, they emphasize that quantum revolution in philosophy was postponed for almost 1 century. But they think that cubism is a revolutionary approach. They want to radicalize, phenomenologically radicalize cubism, because there are phenomenological interpretations to make him more radical. There is some truth in cubism. This is the first point of view, but we should understand that, the first point of view correctly, point of view from inside. But there is the problem with phenomenology itself. Jocelyn Benoit criticized phenomenology, great problems. So phenomenological interpretations of quantum mechanics, in particular cubism, share the same problems. And I claim that cubism is an anti-realistic approach. Experience, not reality, is the primary concept. Actually, I think that it could be reinterpreted if you treat experience as a non-conceptualized immediate experience between which and reality there is no distance. It could be reinterpreted, maybe. So other philosophers, Wheeler, Deutsch, more recently Becker, Christian de Ronda, they thought that the problem is that the philosophy of logical positivism. And they thought that Bohr is a logical positivist. Actually, Michel Bitbol, French philosopher, thinks that he is a neo-Kantian. Anyway, in a sense, later, realistic interpretation, in my view, is a step backward, because standard scientific realism, as I said, is a kind of metaphysical realism. By the way, Einstein-Bohr debate, realism-anti-realism debate, is situated within the modern paradigm. Everett himself criticized logical positivism. And he says, he claims, Everett, that his quantum mechanics, in a certain sense, bridges the positions of Einstein and Bohr. And I agree with Guido Baghiera-Lucas that actually, in a sense, Everett theory succeeds in recapturing Bohr's ideas about complementarity, but in a realist framework. And the Everett theory does not only contain physical reality as relativized to an observational context, and as represented by the relative states, what I call sensitivity of ontology to context sensitivity of ontology, but also an absolute notion of physical reality that remains undisturbed by mechanical interactions, what I call reality as such. So contextual realism bridges the positions of Einstein and Bohr too. Well, just, these quotations, Bohr said, it's wrong to think that the task of physics is to find how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. It looks like an anti-realistic position. Einstein said, I like to think that the moon is there, even if we are not looking at it. And from contextual realism point of view, it's meaningless to speak or to think about nature in itself, exterior world. But what we say or think about nature in context, if you do it correctly, is how nature really is. So it bridges Bohr and Einstein's positions. So I define within the contextual realism Wittgensteinian quantum theory as a Wittgensteinian rule or norm for measuring in a context the quantum reality in which it is anchored within the form of life, practice, and the language games of its use, application. A quantum theory describes quantum reality, but locally, in context, not globally. Actually, any theory that is verified in experience and established, including quantum mechanics, has a domain of applicability, within which it is universal, and as a rule gives truth and knowledge of things themselves by its very nature. Beyond the domain of applicability of a theory, it is strictly speaking meaningless. And I think that one can speak of the universal character of quantum mechanics only in this tautological, or better, or maybe logical sense. Within the domain of its applicability, an established theory acquires the status of a rule, norm, or Wittgensteinian grammar. In particular, hinge propositions, they don't have justification for measuring reality and has a logical certainty. Quantum theory, as a consequence, is not falsifiable. So the quantum measurement problem of application of a quantum theory to reality is an instantiation of the Wittgensteinian rule-following problem, or the problem of the gap between the ideal and the real. And it is dissolved logically. And the quantum measurement problem has many different formulations. You know all them. So, and I think that there are other problems in philosophy. They have the same structure as quantum measurement problem. Measurement, mind-body problem in philosophy of mind, the problem of perceptual access to reality, the Gettier problem in analytic epistemology, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and so on. They have the structure of Wittgensteinian's rule-following problem, the structure of the contextual realism. They are dissolved. So about EPR paradox, from my point of view, it can be explained locally. And in measuring, one identifies just the fragment of reality where the quantum correlation takes place. As the elements of reality, the correlated events do not arise, they are. Only the identification does arise. So a particular correlation exists prior to its identification. This is similar to the way quantum correlation is interpreted in the framework of multiverse interpretation. All possible concrete correlations are realized, but in different worlds. But for me, a particular correlation does not have any identity prior to its identification. There is no sense to think or to speak about it prior to identification. Roughly speaking, all possible correlations are realized in different contexts, but the contexts are not pre-given. They are not exterior to particular measurement observation. So Michel Wittbolz, French philosopher, the Verret interpretation can be understood in the purely theoretical sense. So for me, it means that as introducing a rule for measuring quantum reality. But a substantialization of the Verretian rule entails a metaphysical many-world interpretation, which is problematic. And quantum mechanics is a pure formalism, is incomplete. One should not forget about the pragmatic, practical dimension of the theory. So to compare with the Copenhagen interpretation, they make distinction between the classical and the quantum. I make the distinction, I replace this distinction by the distinction, categorical distinction between the ideal observer and the real system. The ideal observer belongs to the logic of the phenomenon. Wittbolz makes distinction between theoretical and practical, but he is neo-Kantian, not really realist. So contextual realism criticizes Kantianism. So this approach can be compared with a return to the logic of phenomenon. Valia Allori said that many world interpretations save appearances, phenomena, but this is not the same. Because as Jocelyn Benoit has proved, that the notion of phenomenon in the history of philosophy was subjectivized, deformed, truncated, and in the phenomenology of the 20th century, absolutized and naturalized. A correct understanding of the notion of a phenomenon requires a return to the correct Platonic Aristotelian notion of a phenomenon. For Plato, a phenomenon has a normative structure. It presupposes the distinction between appearance and reality. So in my Wittgensteinian terms, a quantum phenomenon is an application of a quantum theory rule to reality, a quantum language game. The quantum observer is not a subjective consciousness, it belongs to the logic of a phenomenon. And I think that Bohr's notions of experience and phenomenon could be understood from this point of view. So just a few conclusions, because I have already said a lot, that quantum mechanics is not a representation of the exterior reality. The correspondence between quantum mechanics, the wave function and reality, this is not, the correspondence between them could be compared with the correspondence between cooking recipes and food prepared according to these recipes. Wittgenstein uses the metaphor of cooking recipes to indicate the grammatical difference between the purely instrumental rules and so I would say real rules anchored in reality. So this approach, contextual realism, is not a kind of instrumentalism. This is a mediation between metaphysical realism and instrumentalism. This is what Everett himself wanted to do. So a wave function neither literally reflects the exterior reality, nor is it merely a predictive mathematical tool. It describes quantum state in the context. And the reduction of a wave function is not a real physical process. To solve or dissolve the metaphysical and conceptual problems, we need to take into account the categorical distinction between the real and the ideal. So for many worlds interpretation, if many worlds interpretation adopts metaphysical realistic point of view, so a wave function describes describes many separate worlds, many branches, splitting at the moment of measurement. But for me, all Everettian branching are real, but they are not predetermined. And the entangled wave function is a Wittgensteinian rule. It does not describe the multiplicity. David Wallace said that wave function describes the multiplicity of worlds. So the gap between this rule and an Everettian world is being fulfilled pragmatically. And there are no so-called problem of the preferred basis or probability system, probability problem, no, neither probability problem, nor problem of the preferred basis. And the worlds are not created, they are identified. I think that the most appropriate notion of probability, but this is just a hypothesis, is Timothy Williamson's evidential probability, conditionalized on evidence as knowledge. For Williamson, total knowledge in context is evidence. But yeah, okay. So a superposition simply for many worlds interpretation corresponds or describes the multiplicity of worlds. For me, does not describe the multiplicity of worlds. Thank you very much. Toda.
Just excuse me for the comment, but essentially it's a comment for the next speakers. Because I was very curious what Wittgenstein has to do with many words. I was trying to read Wittgenstein without much success. And so I suggest that the speakers will try to give maybe much smaller part, but the one which will go through. I was trying to read Wittgenstein. I think many audience didn't try. So I was expecting that you will go much slower. So please, this is really comment we cannot return. There is no time machine for the next time. But the positive thing, there will be a proceeding. So leave the few important things for a talk and put all the rest in the proceeding in this way where we can get it. It can go to audience in any way. If you get a small point which was understood, that people will read your paper and will get everything. And still I have one question. So in the beginning, because for me, many words, I have this, I have a beam splitter and I have two detectors. And for me, it's absolutely determined that there will be one outcome here and one outcome here. And you say that in some sense it's not predetermined. And you also say context. Context in one word. Can you at least explain what is not predetermined in quantum measurement. I know exactly what will happen. I know surely will be word with result up and word with result down.
You mean within the many worlds interpretation, you know exactly what will happen?
Yes, but you're staggering that you said that many words there are splitting, but they are not predetermined.
Yeah,
You repeated
I
what?
agree, but the presupposition is the metaphysical realism, and I think that the presupposition is false. So, of course, if you adopt the many worlds interpretation, metaphysical, so there are many parallel worlds, so every result is given, yeah, is predetermined, of course. But I think that the presupposition is false, that the wave function describes something in the exterior, outside, in the exterior. Would you say that the entangled wave function describes many worlds? No.
Wave function is for microparticles. Many words you need microscopic results. This one or this one. Entangled, just one word with entangled particles. I don't know.
So
no two words.
you deny that you accept the metaphysical realism that all these worlds, many worlds, they really exist, real objects, no?
There is only one physical universe. And then in this physical universe, there are many places, many experiences. Like I started with the right foot. If I start with the left foot, maybe you will be slightly in a different situation. In the same room, similar speakers, but they're really slightly different. But it's one universal wave function. Many different stories.
So I think I agree that there is only one physical world, as you said, right? Yeah? And I think that in this one real physical world, you can identify different Everettian worlds in different contexts. If you make a measurement of a spin, so you have a definite result, yeah, but only one definite result, not all possible results, from my point of view. But you could have had a different result. So in my view, you identify different Everettian worlds in different contexts. They are not predetermined. They do not exist as objects. They do not exist as objects, but they are real in a sense. They are real in the sense that you could identify them. So, for example, if you take the quantum correlation, I say that all correlated events, they are real, but you cannot say that they are correlated with each other before identification. Only when you identify the correlated events, you say that you have a determinate correlation. So does it make sense? So I think that contextual realism combines non-predeterminacy or indeterminism and realism. So ontology sensitive to context. Everettian ontology is sensitive to context. There is no global Everettian ontology. This set of parallel worlds. Do you believe that there is a global ontology in the Quinian sense of Everettian worlds?
Maybe we'll discuss after.
So about the paper, I had sent you a paper written many years ago. So I spoke a little bit different in connection with contextual realism of Jocelyn Benoit, because I think this is an extension of Wittgensteinian philosophy. I thought that it would be something more evaluated than, and the paper I had sent you, there are a lot of details about Saunders' position, Waller's positions, and so on, Greece. But here I thought that I could say something more, so that's why not so much details here.
Let's take one last short question from Eric.
So I'm not entirely sure I understood your idea of context, but if I did, then I think it's the case that we often want to apply quantum mechanics and seemingly do so very successfully in cases where there aren't anything like a context in your sense. So consider the prevalence of hydrogen versus the relative prevalence of hydrogen and helium in the present universe is based on nuclear and atomic processes that happened in the first few minutes after the Big Bang. We calculate that based on our knowledge of these quantum processes. They depend very sensitively, for instance, on the half-life of the neutron. So all of these processes and the calculations we do match the observations we make today with extraordinary accuracy. But if I understand your idea of context, there was nothing like a context in the first 2 minutes or 3 minutes after the Big Bang
Sorry, there is nothing.
that would allow the application of quantum mechanics to calculate, say, the half-life of the neutron. Can you say something about how I'm supposed to understand your idea of context in this situation?
If I understood correctly the question, you mean that if there are any applications, practical applications?
Yeah, this is a very practical application.
I don't think so, because I tried just to understand the presuppositions, philosophical presuppositions of the many worlds interpretations, and my point is that some of them are false, and just to understand the quantum mechanics better, we need to change these presuppositions. But from the point of view of applications, practical applications, I think that all these approaches and many worlds approach, they are just fine. There is no problem.